Today I'm going to look at how I handled post-production on my iPhone shot short film, Preowned. I've created a series of behind-the-scenes videos about how I made my short film, Preowned. This one is about post-production, but I have several others that if you haven't seen those about the production and pre-production, definitely check them out. Link is in the description. And if you haven't seen the actual short film, be sure to check that out too, as spoilers are ahead. The first part of post-production was actually handled during the production because of the integration of Frame.io and FiLMiC Pro. I made a complete video about how this works, and so I won't go into much detail now, but each time I rolled a clip, a proxy file was recorded and then uploaded to the cloud. Then I could preview it or share it with my iPhone or iPad or on a computer. And this was particularly great with this project because I shot ProRes and those files are huge. So I was able to instantly see my footage in my editing app. That would be Premiere Pro. And I could even start my edit if I want to before I even transferred the files to my computer. I did the actual editing in Adobe Premiere Pro, but of course this could be done in any editing app you prefer. The nice thing about using Premiere Pro here was that it links to Frame.io, as I just mentioned. And so I could preview and work with that footage directly, again, without even transferring it to my computer. Now in this case, because it was only a one-day shoot, I did go ahead and transfer those high-res files and use those to edit with. But if it would have been a multi-day shoot, or if I would have had even more footage, I would have done an offline edit using the proxy files, and then later all you have to do is relink to the high-res files. We recorded all the audio to a Zoom recorder, and so I had to sync that in post-production with the video and the reference track I recorded into the phone, which was just the camera mic. With that done, I then proceeded to the actual editing. I spent about 6 weeks or so in post on this film. The first assembly edit, just putting the movie together, was done in only a couple days. But of course, the process of editing is re-editing and revising. One note too is I actually shot both 4K 1.33 times anamorphic and traditional spherical 16:9 footage. And so what I did was edit in a 2K 2:3:9:1 wide aspect ratio, and then I reframed the 16:9 shots within that. So this process took me about several weeks, and simultaneously I was doing rough sound design. For sound design, I did record some original Foley on location while I was shooting. For example, when the key drops from the trunk near the end of the movie. And then, depending on the scene, I added other sound effects I either recorded or that I already owned, or I also used Artlist. I have an Artlist subscription where I get sound effects along with music. And speaking of the music from Artlist, I actually largely scored this movie with music from there as well. That's one of the great things today is the quote-unquote stock music sites are really good. They don't sound like stock music from the past, that's for sure. And of course, there are numerous services out there. This is not a sponsored video by Artlist by any stretch. I just use Artlist, but MusicBed is great, Soundstripe, there are lots of others out there. Really great way for indie filmmakers to get much higher end sounds, music and sound design without breaking the bank. The hardest part of that process is actually finding and choosing the music. But once I got that picked, I then edited in and added that to the various sound design, and I locked picture. And that's very important. You want to picture lock before you move on to these next phases. And of course, picture lock means that the editing is done. You're not going to be moving things around or shifting. At least that's the idea. Sometimes it doesn't stick, but that's what you want to try to have done before you move on. The next phase for me was doing the cleanup and sweetening of the production dialogue. And then of course, from there going on to the sound mix. I did all this in Premiere Pro, but also used Audition. And I used several plugins, including one of my favorite from Isotope, RX8, which is really great at cleaning up dialogue, removing unwanted noise. Doing dialogue cleanup like that can be really tedious, but these type of plugins can really save the day. And there are other ones, including in Final Cut Pro, etc. Everything I'm mentioning here is just what I use. There are always options out there depending on what editing app or what audio editing apps you're using. But to really show what I did, check out this before and after sample of some really noisy audio we recorded in the car lot. There was tons of traffic driving by, but then I cleaned it up.
I think it's malfunctioning or something. Or I don't know, maybe somebody's getting in at night. I don't know.
Well, you lock it, right?
Yeah, I lock it. I'm like super careful. I think it's malfunctioning or something. Or I don't know, maybe somebody's getting in at night. I don't know.
Well, you lock it, right?
Yeah, I lock it. I'm like super careful.
Another option, of course, would be to do looping, where you go in and you replace the actor's dialogue with something you record in a studio. But that takes time and money, and lots of times it doesn't sound nearly as good as the original production audio. And so in this case, for me, the plugins worked well. And just to be clear, I did this process throughout the entire movie. Most scenes weren't this noisy, but I went through and cleaned up all the dialogue and then did the sound mix. With the sound mix now done, I moved on to color grading and visual effects. The color grading I also did directly within Premiere Pro using Lumetri Color, that's their color correction tool, but then my LUT Packs. In addition, I used FilmConvert Nitrate. Again, these are plugins that I use. There are other ones on the market that you might prefer, but these worked well for me. Shooting ProRes log gives you nice latitude in post to be able to bend the footage around when you're doing color correction and using LUTs. And so it's a great way to get started with color correction and grading, but of course you will have to finesse it. And I did a lot of that on this project. By the way, if you're interested in my LUT packs, I'll put a link for those in the description. For this particular film, I wanted a desaturated and cooler look, so a somewhat bluer tone. And as a side note, one thing I did that was kind of tedious, but it's also kind of cool that you can do this, is his shirt was blue. And the color grading I did in certain shots, it made the shirt look black almost, very dark. And so I added a secondary color correction. Basically, I used the eyedropper and created a key around his shirt, that particular color, and I added saturation to it and some luminance. And so that's just something else to consider when you're editing of how you can manipulate the colors, not just from a stylized grading point of view, but from a practical point of view, depending, of course, on what you're trying to do. And I mentioned FilmConvert as I wanted to do a film emulation on this footage, and I chose one from Fuji, and I also added just a little bit of grain. Again, this is an optional thing, but I really like doing this to really any footage, any digital camera, but in particular to mobile shot footage. For the most part, this footage was pretty clean since I shot outside in a fairly bright environment, but I did get video noise sometimes in the shadows. I used a pretty heavy ND filter, and if you've ever shot with a phone, you know that sometimes, even in brighter conditions, you can get video noise using ND especially, or even just bringing the exposure down to a level that you want. If the phone auto exposes, it'll usually brighten the shadows and eliminate the noise. But in a movie, often you want to have a moodier look, and it will bring in noise. And so to fight that, I use Neat Video. It's a great plugin that will denoise your footage. Unfortunately, I didn't have to use it a lot, but I did use it some, and in a couple shots in particular, it really made a big difference. And just like the other plugins I've used, there are other types of plugins depending on what app you're using. For example, DaVinci Resolve has its own built-in. Just depends on what app you're using. The only caveat would be if you're editing in LumaFusion on an iPad or an iPhone, currently they don't have any denoising product, at least not one that I know of. If you have some really noisy footage, you may have to bring it into a traditional editing app. The last piece of the puzzle was some visual effects shots. Now, one shot in this movie is an obvious visual effects shot. Spoiler alert, it is when he looks in the trunk and gets basically disintegrated by a fireball. But before I talk about that one, I want to show one that is not so noticeable. And as a matter of fact, these type of shots get done all the time in movies. On this wide shot here, I inadvertently captured the mic and actually Cliff, the guy who shot the project with me, holding the mic. And so I had to go in and erase him out in quotes from the shot. Now, if I would have had a background plate for this exact shot, it wouldn't have been a big deal. But unfortunately, I didn't. I had moved the camera. And so I had to combine a couple shots using Photoshop And within Photoshop, I had to use content aware that'll fill in spaces. It copies the pixels close to it and almost clones it and makes it disappear, in quotes. And then the trunk shot, of course, where Arnie, our hero, looks in and then catches fire and is burned alive. That shot was done by Cliff Richard, who I mentioned earlier, and he used After Effects to do that, and some particles from Trapcode Particular, along with fire elements from the Action VFX collection, some spark elements from Video Copilot Action Essentials, and smoke and some sound effects from Envato Elements. I was really happy with what he achieved here. One interesting thing too I wanted to show, we actually did 2 versions. Here's the one in the final film. And then here is the alternate. I like them both, but I thought the first one was better in the end because it happened faster, and I think it fit the story better, and it was a little more of a surprise. Then the last thing I did was create a master video file for my archive, which was a 2391 4K ProRes file. I upscaled the movie from 2K to 4K within Premiere Pro. And then, of course, I exported a file for YouTube. It too is 4K, but it was H.264. And on that one, I did a 2:1 aspect ratio. Currently, YouTube does not allow you to do full widescreen 2391 and keep video elements on the end of your videos. So that's why I didn't do that. But I use the widescreen in other places like Vimeo or any future screenings at a festival or whatever, although I've not entered any, so I may never do that. So that's it. That's how I did post-production on the short film. Be sure to check out the actual short film if you haven't seen it already. Of course, you've seen all the spoilers, but check that out anyway. And importantly, don't forget, get out there and make your own short film. That's one reason I make these videos, to try to help you guys get inspired to go do your own thing. Don't wait to create. Thanks for watching. This is Blake Calhoun. Please like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.